Bam.
Hello, this is Brad Thayer.
And you're Kimo Fanell.
Hello, this is Kimo Fanell, and this is Breaking It Down show. Let me do that one more time.
Okay, well, we're live. Go ahead and do it again. Yeah, it's fine.
This is the Breaking Down show.
The Break It Down show, man. The Break It Down show.
Couldn't even do that right.
You know what? It's all uphill from here. We're going to be good. We like going uphill because that's harder, and stuff that's harder is better. So I appreciate you guys coming on the show. And screw the intro. Who cares about that? We're not here to talk about intros. We're here to talk about your guys' new book. And here is the link for it. I'm going to reduce us in size so we don't stomp on anybody. Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. So let's talk about the impetus for this book, because obviously we have China in our sights. We're always worried about what they're doing, their big 100-year plan and all that kind of thing. But what specifically inspired you guys, and who went to who to say, hey, let's write this book together?
Well, it was a joint effort thoroughly. And Pete, it's great to join you today. And it was Jim and I have different backgrounds, obviously, but we came to understand, of course, a similar central question, which is how is it that China could grow so rapidly from 1990, when it's about 0.6% of world gross domestic product per capita, to in 2019, when it's about 19%. So how could that happen? How could that rise occur? And then how could it occur without the U.S. doing anything about it? So Jim and I were both flummoxed and puzzled by that issue, which strategically should not have happened, right? It would be the U.S. should have taken measures, and would have in the past, to stop the growth of China and its obviously deleterious effect on America, the American homeland, U.S. allies and partners throughout the world. And so that's the central question of our book. How did this happen? And our argument is basically the U.S. caused it. It was first an element of Deng Xiaoping, who's one of the greatest strategists of the 20th century, who recognized that if he could make America his partner, the Chinese Communist Party could reach out to American businesses and politicians to get them invested in the growth of the Chinese Communist Party. He would have a very important and invaluable, in fact, ability to rise without having the U.S. take the expected counter steps, which has always happened in international politics. When one great power is rising, other great powers act against it. Well, the central puzzle here is that didn't happen. The U.S. never took those steps against China because of Deng's steps. But secondly, and the big part of the book is, it was the U.S. It was Wall Street, the Chamber of Commerce, U.S. investors, in time, U.S. politicians, universities, media, philanthropic foundations. We can just go down the list of the American elite, and they were all linked to or tied to in some capacity or taking money from Chinese entities. So the U.S. never responded to the growth of China. So in the book, we explore that question. That's the argument. We look at how, in detail, how the U.S. actually failed to respond to it. And then we talk about some solutions, steps that the U.S. should take now to repair the damage that was caused by our greatest strategic failure.
Kimo?
Yeah, my background is I was in the Navy for 29 years, and I was naval intelligence, and I spent most of my career in the Pacific, and the last 15 years specifically focused on the PRC and the kind of operational tactical actions of the PLA, and especially the Navy. And so I experienced what we talk about in the book is running into this buzzsaw called the engagement school, which is this mindset that said that we have to engage with China, because if we engage with China, things will get better. And so what happened basically was things didn't get better. And so when we started asking questions about why do we continue to engage, people didn't want to hear that, and some people were affected by it in their careers and whatnot. But the fact is, as Brad says, we were not prepared. The people that were responsible, that were their jobs were to prepare and make sure that we didn't get surprised by a rising power that comes out of the blue. We actually were, even though, there was all this evidence there over the years, especially in the last 25 years, of what their true intentions were. I think, as we talk about in the book, a true understanding of communism going back even to, the Nixon administration would have been much more willing to say, hey, we're going to use the PRC to help us, defeat the Soviet Union at the time, which was the peer closest existential threat to the United States. But by 1989, we switched recognition in '79 from Taipei to Beijing, and we started having this relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. But by 1989, the Soviet Union's falling apart, and then we watched Tiananmen Square happen. There should have been people inside our national security establishment that would have said, hey, we need to be cautious here and we need to be careful. And instead, we did the exact opposite. And we invoked this kind of policy of engagement that just dominated everything that the U.S. government did for the next 40 years. And so that threat and what we witnessed in terms of the modernization of the military was something that I was, focused in on and concerned me. And so that was kind of my contribution to the book, was my experiences in the Navy and in the intelligence community, watching the engagement school and this concept of threat deflation, where we're constantly always downplaying the threat from the PRC, whether it was geopolitical, whether it was economic, and most assuredly in the military domain, we were not appreciating the military that was being built by the PRC at their highest priority. Just this last week or 2 weeks, we had the National People's Congress in China that they hold every March. And they announced that they were setting a target GDP growth, gross domestic product growth, for 2024 to be 5%. But before they announced that, they said, that's our goal for the year. That's what we want to grow our economy to. They did announce, like they do every year before they announce the GDP target, they said, but we are going to grow the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, by 7.2%. And that's 30 years of the Chinese Communist Party prioritizing spending on the PLA as their number one priority. And they've gotten results for it. We're watching them now talk about their fourth aircraft carrier, not like ours, not as good as ours, but they went from 0 to 4, 0 to 3 in 10 years, 12 years. They've got more ships than we do. 25 years ago, we outclassed them by 100 ships. Now they outclass us by 100 ships. So in the 25-year period, we went flipped over, and they've become the largest Navy. They've got more anti-ship cruise missiles, supersonic, hypersonics, anti-ship ballistic missiles that we're seeing used today in the Red Sea, which is technology that came from China. So it's clearly a major existential threat, and we're not prepared because we didn't call it that. Part of the reason for the book was also that we're in this election year, and we're trying to raise this issue as a topic that says, hey, this is something that should be discussed amongst the presidential candidates to say, hey, what are we going to do about this? And as we document in the book, we document from Nixon through till present what each administration essentially did in terms of engagement with the PRC. And it was only the previous administration that broke that mold. And people can have their opinions about that person, the former President Trump, but the reality is that administration broke the policy of unconstrained and unaccountable engagement, or as Pompeo called it, blind engagement, that had existed. They broke it. They turned that around, and a lot of us were very happy about that, obviously. But now what we saw in this last year is a return to engagement. We saw Blinken go. He had to delay his trip to Beijing because of the spy balloon that they weren't going to tell us about unless some citizen in Montana had actually filmed it. We sent the Secretary of Treasury there, who actually physically kowtowed to the Chinese Communist Party, Secretary Yellen. We sent Climate Czar Kerry there, who said, I got to work with the Chinese to save the planet for climate change. And we didn't send, but Kissinger went on his last visit of his life to China last year. And then we sent Secretary of Commerce Raimondo. It all led up to this big summit in San Francisco last November, where Xi and Biden met, and they announced that we're resuming mill-to-mill cooperation and exchanges and engagement. So it seems to me that we have an administration that's, for whatever reason, waited 3 years, but is now fully embracing a return to engagement. Now, they call it other things. They don't say that. That word engagement will now not be used by politicians, but that's what they're promoting. And we're worried about it because that has put us in a position where we're fueling and funding the very enemy that says they want to kill us and destroy us, and has actually killed us. 70 to 100,000 people killed each year from fentanyl. Over.
Yeah, no, that's good. Let me push back then, so that we have a good, healthy conversation about this. John, you're a Navy guy. The boss gets to make those decisions, right? That's their job. And when you say existential crisis, man, I hear that too much. So I don't, not you guys, but in general, that whole phrase has become too buzzwordy, and I think it's bullshit, right? So is it existential for real? Is it existential? And look, the boss gets to make that call on foreign policy, and if that's the direction we're going, and I am hard on this current administration, because as they've risen up in the ranks, it's a whole path full of stuff that they've gotten wrong. So I have no confidence in Secretary Blinken, no confidence in Secretary Austin, no confidence in these people that have made these mistakes that have put us in an overall less advantageous position. So let's understand that I'm critical of these folks, but is it actually existential? And why isn't it the boss's call? I mean, President Trump got to go his direction. President Biden gets to go his. What has to change? And I don't know. What do you think? I mean, I'm challenging you, but I also understand what you're saying.
Well, it's an existential threat for two major reasons. It's existential first because of the PRC's capabilities. So somebody may hate you, but if they don't have any capabilities, that's a second order or third order threat. Wedded to those and capabilities in every area. Jim illuminated the military capabilities, particularly in the naval realm, but in the nuclear realm as well. Now, new categories of weapon systems, hypersonic weapons that they have tested and deployed. Large numbers of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles pointed at the U.S. and also allies like Japan and partners like Taiwan. In the diplomatic realm, you see the PRC working to unhinge really our alliance networks through Belt and Road initiatives, debt diplomacy that you see, the exploitation that's present whenever the Chinese entities show up. In the technological realm as well, changing norms in international politics. For example, with respect to Antarctica or the norms surrounding Antarctica or the Arctic, or the deep sea, or fisheries, or the moon, planetary exploration and space. In the ideological realm as well, right, where the Chinese are talking about creating a new future for the world. So if we look at their capabilities, we're seeing the expansion of their economy has led to the expansion of their ability, their military capabilities, diplomatic capabilities, technology, universities, soft power, if you will, Confucian institutes. Now, wedded to those capabilities is intent. And the intent is based in their ideology, and their intent is as a communist ideology. And in the book, we're explicit that we take their communist ideology very seriously. We don't dismiss it. These individuals are adherents, of course, to a Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, Maoist worldview, as Xi Jinping, the current leader, says so explicitly. And he has a conception of himself as essentially in a very worrisome way, as the equal of Mao Zedong. So here we have intent to remake international politics along the lines that they seek, and they have the capabilities to do so. Now, that's not benign, right? They want to remake it based on tyrannical lines, right? They are committing a genocide against Muslims in Xinjiang, as well as other provinces. They've crushed the Tibetan people. They crushed human rights, religious freedom, political freedoms, other human rights throughout China. They're hyper-aggressive with their expansion in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, violating international law with respect to the Permanent Court of Arbitration's decision in 2016 regarding the dispute that the PRC has with the Philippines, where the court found in favor of the Philippines at Scarborough Shoal. And the PRC said, get bent, right? We're not going to do anything about it. We don't care what you rule, right? We're going to do what we want to do in a very, it's reminiscent of Thucydides' Melian dialogue, right? Where he says, the Melians tell the Athenians, hey, we're, take it easy on us. We made a mistake. And the Athenians say, hey, well, the strong do what they will and the weak endure what they must. Well, that's the lesson that Beijing is teaching the rest of the world. This is hyper-aggressive. Aggression against India, the fact that they're supplying the Russians in their war against Ukraine, the fact that they provide cover for North Korea. This is a regime which is remaking international politics by working within institutions like the World Health Organization. Remember COVID, of course, right? In one respect, it seems a long time ago, but in fact, it wasn't at all a long time ago. And the PRC lied to the World Health Organization and got the World Health Organization to repeat the lies that the PRC was saying with respect to how the virus spread. And it was not forthcoming, obviously, in that respect. So subverting existing international institutions while creating new ones. Right. So they're working within institutions like World Health while creating Belt and Road Initiative, AIIB, for example, and so many others to replace the system that the Anglo-Americans, the British and the United States created in the wake of World War II, which has provided stability for international politics for generations. So their intent, wedded to their capabilities, makes them an existential threat, that it has the ability to reach into the United States, influence our politics, influence Americans in a way the Soviets could have only have dreamt of so doing, right? With TikTok, other apps, with business interests, and the fact that they're often partnered with American entities means that they are indeed existential, operating within the U.S. as well as outside of the U.S. To replace the order that the U.S. created, to undermine our alliances, and to make the world a far more dangerous place.
That's great. And by the way, I apologize, Jim. I think I called you John at one point. So I wanted to make sure I covered that. A lot of what you're talking about, 100% true, obviously, right? So when we look at the president who's sworn to protect and take care of us, we do have this fentanyl crisis. We do have, I don't know what the number is today, but about every 90 minutes, we open a counterintelligence investigation against China. We know that they're actively stealing our secrets. Before they even get classified, they go into the universities and do all these things. That sounds like a lot of problems that feed into the things that you're talking about now. So I guess when we look at this, how much of this is just natural growth from the stability that the Western world has provided over the past 100 years, and you have to withstand that? How much do we need to allow China's middle class to be successful? And can we not reduce threat by having all of this Chinese investment into our country? I'm coupling this with fentanyl and aggressive tactics like you're talking about in general. How do we allow China to thrive? They've got the most countries boarding them than any other country. So they've got their own problems. How do we balance a healthy growth with while protecting our interests and our partnered countries' interests?
I'll go ahead. First of all, we have allowed the PRC to rise. I mean, we have helped them, not allowed. We've helped them over the last 3-4 decades. We've poured in trillions of dollars into China. So it's not like we have been xenophobic and said we're not going to help the Chinese Communist Party, or we're not going to help the people of China. We said, hey, let's be good partners and let's try to work with them and do these things. And it's only apparent now that, Brad said, their intentions are not good. Their intentions are against the United States. They say that in and amongst themselves. That's in their documents. They say that they say that to us repeatedly. They tell our allies and friends that we're the malign actor and that our system is a failed system, and they want to replace it. They talk about this global governance system, global developments initiative, global security initiative, digital China, global digital China. So they have a vision of the world where they're the global leader. and the only nation that stands in the way is the United States. So it's not a matter of just natural growth. They've had their natural growth. They've had as Brad pointed out, you go back, they were only 1% or less than 1% of the world's GDP. Now they're about 20. Okay, they've grown, and they've grown their middle class after they destroyed it. Let's talk about what Mao did in the Great Leap Forward and what he did in the Cultural Revolution. Millions, tens of millions of people were killed by the Chinese Communist Party, and it was only through Deng's hide and bide strategy and saying, let's open ourselves up and allow foreign money to come in, that we can grow ourselves to be a power to take over. But in the process, we were able to go in and help Chinese people. So we've done that, and we didn't have any malign ambitions towards China. During the Vietnam War, the United States didn't say, well, let's beat Vietnam and go invade China. We didn't do that. Even after the Korean War, when they came down and came across the Yalu and killed thousands and tens of thousands of American military personnel on the Korean Peninsula, we didn't say, let's go march in and take over China. So at every turn in history, since the People's Republic of China has been in existence, the U.S. has shown them a kind turn, if you will. And what did we receive in return? Well, we received 70,000 to 100,000 Americans dead from a drug that they pushed in. Or we see 350 ICBM silos filled with DF-41s that are pointed at us to hold us hostage in a nuclear blackmail so that they can take Taiwan or the Senkakus or go to war with India over disputed territory. So I hear your argument. I understand people are fatigued with wars. I think people are fatigued with that word existential. But in this case, of all the words, this is the one where we should have been paying attention. And we're not advocating for boots on the ground. This is not a boots on the ground solution. This is about what we did kind of with the Cold War, which is about hardening ourselves to the influence from the Chinese Communist Party, not allowing things like TikTok or their propaganda, their political warfare agents, and the elite capture that have already are in our government and in our academic institutions and in Wall Street and in Silicon Valley, to make sure that those people can't make rules or weaken us any further, and to make sure that we have a true deterrent capability. I remember when Secretary Mattis took over as SecDef under the Trump administration in his congressional testimony for his hearing for SecDef, I remember he opened his testimony by saying, I don't hear a word much in DC anymore. It's called deterrence. Now, unfortunately, that came and went, and we still don't hear it. We don't talk about deterrence as a prime tool in our kit bag to make sure that a malign actor doesn't have the ability to put the knife to our throat and at his timing slit our throats when he wants to. And so this is kind of really the thesis of our book, which is to say, we didn't recognize a threat. It is a threat, and we have to prepare ourselves for it. And part of that is an intellectual preparation to recognize the threat of communism, that it's not just some benign ideology that we can talk about in a classroom and then go have some beers afterwards and think everything's going to be fine. It's an ideology that stands against the American system, stands against freedom and liberty. And we saw that in spades during the COVID, right? We saw what they did in China. You couldn't leave your apartment without an app on your phone that said you got a green check mark. And then once you got out of your apartment, you couldn't get on the elevator without that green check mark. And you couldn't get out of the compound, the gate at the compound, to get on the street without that. And you couldn't cross the street because the crosswalks interrogated your phone to make sure that you had that green check mark. You couldn't get into a store. You couldn't get food. You couldn't do anything, because they want to control every aspect of people's lives. And they're collectivists. So they look at people as collectives, and they don't look at people as individuals. That's not what America stands for. That's not the freedom and liberty that we've shown around the world. And as Brad, likes to talk about, who's coming to America? People are still trying to come into America. They're not trying to come into communist China. They're not trying to sneak into communist North Korea. They're not trying to sneak into Iran. They're not trying to sneak into Russia. It's only America that they want to come to, or a free and Western Europe at this point. So I think it's really hard right now to make these arguments given what we've done over the last 35 years. And we talk about this in the book, that we were distracted by what we label minor wars. They're not minor to anybody that fought in them or who died, but in the existential threat, they were not existential. They were immediate at that time after 9/11, and we responded accordingly. But they were not an existential threat in the sense that the Chinese Communist Party and the power that they have, their intentions and capabilities are so much greater that we failed to deal with that. And the very people that get paid to see out and think ahead and to be strategic failed because they were following they were walking around bumping into things because they could only see at the end of their nose. And that's the real problem.
Brad, do you want to add to that?
Well, I agree with what Jim said in terms of the thesis of the book. I think it's also important to recognize that we don't want to get into a mistaken assumption. I mean, the key aspect of the book's argument is we need to have a renaissance in strategic thought. And so we don't want to have an idea or the argument, which was often advanced in the wake of the Cold War, that economics causes peace or trade is going to generate peace. That's not what occurred, right? I mean, what we did is we hollowed out our manufacturing. It flowed to China. We invested. We provided rocket fuel for China to become the power that it is at the cost of our manufacturing, at the cost of American jobs, at the cost of damage to communities throughout the United States who are adversely affected by it, while at the top, a small number of individuals, in a relative sense, to be sure, profited enormously from what they were doing with respect to China. So we know we need to go back to the recognition of what our strategic interests are and follow them. And the first rule of strategy is don't help your enemy and don't trade with your enemy. First of all, there's no reason to have manufacturing in China. It could be in the United States, it could be in India, it could be in Vietnam, it could be many places throughout the world, not under essentially this tyrannical government in Beijing. So returning to the principles of strategy is one of the major arguments of the book in terms of looking at solutions. And that is, don't invest in them, don't trade with them, and treat them as the enemy as they are. And simply to underscore, this indeed is existential because the world that they're remaking is a test, really, of the dispositive issue of the 21st century, which is either tyranny is going to be dominant this century or freedom is. And if the CCP gets what it wants, tyranny is going to be dominant. They're going to set the rules of the road for the 21st century. And we fought these battles in the 20th century. And by the skin of our teeth and with much sacrifice, we won and defeated tyranny, whether it was the Italian fascists or the Nazis or Japanese militarism or communism of the Soviet Union and its allies. We won, but at enormous cost. Now we have to go through that again with another tyrannical government. And if we don't treat it with the seriousness, the immediacy, the urgency, and steeling ourselves, while at the same time recognizing the prodigious advantages we have in our ideology, because our ideology is far superior to theirs, right? We face another test. And the American people, again, a major thrust of the book, is to awaken the American people to this danger and illuminate some solutions about what must be done, again, to think strategically. It's a dangerous world, and we do have enemies, and those enemies are out to get us. Trotsky had that great line, right? You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you, right? It doesn't matter what you think about the Chinese Communist Party. They're gunning for you. So you better act accordingly.
That's great. I appreciate you guys talking about this. And, my job is to push back and try to find the spots where we can ask the obvious questions, right? So let's go the other direction for a while. If Pete was president, first off, I would start cutting EOs. Like, hey, Congress, start writing laws. I'm tearing up EOs. That'd be the first thing I would do. The next thing I'd do is I'd get on the phone with China and say, hey, if fentanyl doesn't stop flowing into our borders, you're going to have a problem with us. And I would say, by the way, knock off all of the intelligence stuff you're doing against us. If I have the current pace of counterintelligence cases doesn't stop, you're going to have a problem with us. We're not going to get along financially anymore. And so I totally understand our need. I wouldn't say it's existential, but I would totally understand our need to try to change that. All of that stuff causes pain, and Americans are soft. We don't want to have anything in our normal lives change, even if it's potentially better for us. So how do you get the ideologies in line? And I hate even thinking about ideology. Like, if the strategy needs to change, great. How do you get the tactics to align with the strategy, to feed the strategy the thing it needs to advance? By the way, we get this shit wrong a lot too. So let's talk a little bit about how all that stuff goes together. When you can convince President Pete or President Next or whoever it's going to be that, like, this is the direction we need to go, and you have to bear the weight of the demos and their anger at more expensive things changing. It's going to be hard. And by the way, China gets a say in all this stuff. So let me throw that back to you guys and discuss. You guys are doing great, by the way. I really appreciate what you're talking about.
I'll go ahead and then let Brad follow on this one. I think the first thing, and we've been kind of talking about this as we've been doing a lot more of these podcasts and radio shows in the last 2 weeks since the book's come out, the issue of education. I mean, we have a dearth of education that tells us why it's good to be an American, why America's good, what our founding principles are, what the Declaration is, what the Constitution is. So we have a body politic today that doesn't understand that what formed this nation, what the values and principles are, and then the fact that we had to fight for keeping them every so often throughout our history, whether it was the Civil War or World War I or World War II or the Cold War. I mean, we had to pay. We had to pay with our own discomfort. You know people, I know people that died fighting in the Middle East. Okay, they're gone, right? Okay, so I got it. I agree. Americans are soft, much softer than, I'm 61, so I mean, I think I'm probably the oldest guy in this room here. I remember growing up, I remember my grandfather as a coal miner. I remember people from that generation. I knew a guy that had gone off. He was in college and in World War I in Canada and went off to fight in World War I. I mean, he was like 18, 19 years old, 20 years old, and went off to fight in World War I. So, I mean, I remember those people. I remember how they were cut. I remember the shake of their hand, the calluses on their hands, and the way that they were willing to go and fight for what they believed in. We don't have that today. And so I think we need to start, and Brad in the book does a good job of explaining this idea of grand strategy and power politics. I think that's an academic effort at high schoolers or collegiate people in universities and our joint professional military education. But I'm more concerned about what I'm seeing today going down in our K through 12. What's going on, and what are our kids being taught, and how are they being trained to be American citizens? So we have to go there. We have to do that. And that means each of us that knows and is having this dialogue and shares some of these values may have a variance of opinion on certain aspects, but I think we all would agree that America's the best system. And if it is, then what are we doing to make sure that we perpetuate that? And it's not propaganda, it's not ideology, it is reality. In the course of human history, America's done more to help other nations. When we won World War II, we were the dominant world power. We had the nukes, we had everything. And we could have been like any other great power throughout history. We could have dominated people with abuse and malign actions and disdain and treated them roughly, but we didn't, because that's not who we are. And we've lost that appreciation as a nation. We've got to bring that back, because I don't see it today. We just did some interviews today with some younger crowds, 30-somethings and younger, and there's a kind of an ambiguity about our history and whether or not we're good or bad, and whether or not we should even confront China, or if we do confront them, what could they do to us? So there's no appetite, there's no understanding that sometimes you have to fight and you have to sacrifice for something that's larger than you. So we have to bring that back in, I think, is the first order. then there's a whole lot of other things that we should do. But I think for me, and I think it's in our book, is this idea of restoring our knowledge of who we are as a nation, the principles that we stand for, and that as Brad says, it's a dangerous world and the people don't like us. And we have to understand that. We can't shy away from it. You can't just go through life thinking that everybody's going to be friendly if you talk to them some more. There are certain people that are really bad, certain countries that are really bad, and they would just as soon blow your head off than to talk to you. And we have forgotten that, and we need to get back to that.
Let me ask you about this, because one of our problems is that China is such a big market. Our big corporations want to have access to that market. And so there is a give and take there where we need some cooperation because our corporations need to thrive, and that's the way they want to do it. So and I think Elon Musk is a great example of this with Starlink. He's like, hey, I have to use Starlink and I'm not going to use it for war, except for in these limited cases, because I still got to work with these other countries, right? So that's a big push-pull thing for us. And again, who's the president who's going to sit down and say, here's the direction I want to go? We're picking from the bottom. Maybe you guys are Biden or Trump people, but we're picking from the bottom of the barrel. We're not getting our best and brightest. We're not getting our most vibrant. So how do you fix that part of the problem? It's one thing to say, hey, let's improve our education and focus on civics and understanding rights and everything. I get that. But who's going to do that?
Well, it's the recognition, of course, that businesses at the end of the day are dependent on American power and the survival of the United States. All of these guys live in the United States. All of them educate their children in the United States. All of them have health care in the United States, right? They're not going to China to get medicine. They're not sending their kids to China to get their education, right? They're heavily invested in the U.S. And if the U.S. falls, where are they going to run? Right? New Zealand's, they think they're going to escape to New Zealand, right? Well, New Zealand's not going to be safe for these guys, right? It's a small state. And the power of the PRC will reach into everywhere, including small states like New Zealand or Switzerland, or there's no escape. So they essentially have a conception of how the world operates, which is grossly out of touch with reality and incredibly naive. They're dependent on the survival of the United States and American power. So they need to start acting like it. And that means controlling their investments around the world, and particularly with communist China. Why don't we start asking them, well, why aren't you building something in East Palestine, Ohio, right? Or, somewhere in the United States or Vietnam or India or elsewhere, right? Yeah. China's a big market, to be sure, but there are many other big markets. The Soviet Union was a big market, and yet the U.S. government did not allow U.S. businesses to trade with the Soviet Union, right? There were major restrictions on that trade because the idea was the Soviets were an existential threat. And you don't help your enemy. And that rule needs to be, again, resuscitated, right? That has to come to the fore. If it's been in hibernation or if it's been buried, I don't know. But it needs, once again, to come to the fore to ask the BlackRocks, and we can just go down the list, what are you doing? You're helping an adversary whose values are directly opposed to yours. If the U.S. falls and you're contributing to the weakening of the United States in a relative sense, right, you're going to suffer as well, and there won't be any escape from it. You're not going to blast off to Mars, right, and live on Mars beyond the grasp of the Chinese Communist Party, which, by the way, claims Mars. So these guys have got to start acting like Americans and start acting like they've got skin in the game, because they do have skin in the game. And it's their policies that are largely responsible, and their avarice and greed that's largely responsible for feeding the beast, allowing the Chinese Communist Party to survive, to get through very difficult times, and then ultimately to grow to the power that it is today. So there has to be a reckoning and accountability for these individuals, and they have to start acting like American corporations, and recognizing that they, in fact, have every component, every element is of their happiness, of their success in life, of the success of their industry, of their business, is dependent on the survival and thriving of the United States. So, this is, to my mind, these guys are like the old regime, Ancien regime, right? These are the guys who are thinking that after the French Revolution and got rid of all of the aristocrats, right? The aristocrats are trying to make a comeback and pretending that nothing had changed, right? But in fact, everything has changed in no small measure because of the policies that they adopted and the wealth that they made. So that has to be absolutely addressed. There has to be accountability and the revival and the recognition of the strategic interests of the United States and the role that these men and women will play, these captains of industry. It was, Pete, obscene that 400 business leaders gave 2 standing ovations to Xi Jinping, a communist dictator in the Bay Area. If you recall, in November, when that happened. It was appalling and it was obscene that these individuals, this man is committing genocide against Muslims in China today. He's crushed the Tibetan people. He crushed democracy in Hong Kong. He's planning to invade Taiwan. He's going to kill Americans as a consequence of that, as well as the Taiwanese. He's going to destroy the chip factories upon which our economy depends. And these folks are celebrating him, right? That is simply appalling, and that needs to be reversed immediately to recognize that you can't, however big a market it is, right? You're going to make the crocodile a lot fatter, and that crocodile is going to eat you too at the end of the day. There's not going to be an escape from it. And all of your wealth and your 5th and 20th home and your 7th yacht and your 20th airplane, private airplane, is not going to save you from the consequences of your actions if you don't recognize reality. And if you don't start acting like an individual who recognizes the vulnerability and danger that we face today, again, an existential threat from the Chinese Communist Party.
Joseph Grant chimes in with, how do you change that momentum?
You change it through leadership. I think you mentioned, the president gets a call.
Being President Pete? Oh, no.
Yeah. If you were in, you'd have some impact on that. And we actually have examples. We can go back to the last administration. We had somebody that used the bully pulpit to speak out about being ripped off by China. And what did that do? That sent Tim Cook and Apple scurrying to divest their investments in China, and they started moving market share and part of their industry out to India.
Right.
But now what happened this week? Did you see the big news?
No,
Tim Cook and Apple just announced a new $140 million research center in Shanghai for Apple, along with a new boutique store and more millions there. So leadership actually does have an impact. The reason we vote for presidents is because they actually do have some impact beyond executive orders. The idea that you are speaking out and saying things, that's one way to change the momentum. Another way to change the momentum is through what we're doing. We're talking to guys like you, trying to alert people to this threat so that when regular Americans go to the store and they pick up that thing and they look at it and they say, why am I buying this when it's made in China? Maybe I should look for something made in America or someplace else. And then if you're going to do that for the small things at the retail store, what about your 401k? Have you looked at your 401k lately? How much of it is being invested in China? We just went through a thing in the previous administration. I'm retired military. Pete, you were in the military. You had the thrift savings program. Everybody invested in the thrift savings program, and the BlackRock guys were trying to take our savings, our retirement, and put it in China. It was like $40 billion worth of money from American military and government retirees that they wanted to open up and invest in China. And a bunch of us got together in this committee on present danger China that Brad and I are with, and we started screaming about it, and we got the guy's attention. And he said, no, that's stupid. Why would we do that? So it's not just one guy by himself, but it's an informed, literate body politic of citizens. So that's why I get back to the education. I mean, it's complicated. It's not one silver bullet. I think that's another effect of our current society. Is you said we're kind of lethargic and lazy and apathetic, and we're also.
I said soft.
Okay, I'll say the more. Some of that is. That's part of it. But the point is, when you get to that point of where you are soft and not willing to get off your couch to go get what you need or defend yourself, it basically makes you look for simpler solutions, to one-shot solutions, instead of understanding that they're complex issues that require complex, sustained effort by people to reverse the trend. It's not easy. It's not simple. And the companies don't want to do it. They look at their quarterly earnings report and they don't want to show a downward trend. But the fact of the matter is, we did start seeing people and companies in America start to move out there. And I think we could continue to push on that if we were better educated as a nation.
It's interesting. You talked about President Trump, and I recall specifically when that happened, when Apple was not the only company to bring manufacturing back to the United States, right? But the second I say that, I'm like, if I say this is going to take this thing in a crazy emotional way for a lot of people, because he is such a caustic person and he creates so much. I would like to say, like, he brags that he's going to shoot himself in the foot to undermine his success, and then he goes and does it. My foot. He is the most exasperating person. And so you take these policies that maybe would work, holding other countries accountable, like, hey, you don't get this sweet deal anymore. I'm in charge now. You're going to get, you're going to pay us more equally. We lose our minds, not because it's a better deal, but because we hate that dude. And so how do we, again, look at the current primary system. We got the same two dudes running from the last time, and I don't think either of them are great people. So we can talk about these things, but who's going to who out there is going to hold China accountable, and what party is going to allow that person to get elected? We hate ourselves right now.
Well, what's the alternative?
We're going to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable, right? I mean, when we know the nature of the threat, this is an illegitimate government. Communism has nothing to do with China. It has nothing to do with Chinese civilization, the greatness of Chinese civilization, Han polity, a recognition of the greatness of Chinese dynasties in the past, or its Republican experiment. This has absolutely nothing to do with it. That this was a Western ideology that was forced on China by the Communist International and Joseph Stalin, who forced it on the Chinese people through Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. So this regime is entirely illegitimate. And I think Americans need to start recognizing that you've got a gang of thugs who've been ruling a great people, a great civilization since 1949, and they're beyond the pale of international society. And we should start recognizing that, just as we recognized with apartheid South Africa, that was beyond the pale of international society, and the South Africans were not allowed to participate in international society. So too, the Chinese Communist Party should be seen as such. And when you see it that way, then you've got questions to ask Tim Cook, right, or Larry Fink, or all of these guys. Well, they've crushed democracy in Hong Kong. They're committing a genocide against Muslims. They're hyper aggressive, and they're absolutely illegitimate. What the heck are you doing trading with them, or having anything to do with them whatsoever, just as you would not have traded with apartheid South Africa? So asking those types of questions is absolutely essential. And then that also allows us to recognize these guys are built on a house of cards, right? And the best thing we could do for peace in the 21st century is get rid of them and consign them to the ash heap of history, through the recognition that they are false and illegitimate, and they terrorize and oppress through their tyrannical rule the Chinese people. And the Chinese people would be far better off if we could get rid of them. And so working with folks in China and people of goodwill around the world, our allies, our partners, again, the Chinese diaspora, folks within China, right? Let's break down the Great Firewall, which is one of the ways this thuggish regime stays in power, by restricting access to the wider world, right? Let's have Larry Fink invest in technologies that bypass the Great Firewall, punch a hole in it, fly over it, go under it, go around it, right? Let's have Elon Musk, right? Rather than making batteries in China, let's have him invest in ways to break through the Great Firewall. Let's have some investment in those areas so that the Chinese people and their voices can be heard around the world. And in that way, the true nature, that ugly face, the hideous face of the Chinese Communist Party can be seen for what it is, and people can work to get rid of it and overthrow it and cast it beyond the pale. And again, of acceptable international society. That's what needs to be done. And I think too often we're on the back foot. We're talking about TikTok, right? And having to do this, that, or the other thing.
Yeah.
Right. Well, why aren't we doing TikToks in China against the CCP? Right. Let's have Elon Musk invest some money in that, or Larry Fink take those $40 billion, right? That was Jim's and his colleagues, Pete, your retirement funds, right? Based on the sweat and blood of that, and find a way to break down the Great Firewall so that the Chinese people can finally be free of this yoke. Let's put them on the back foot by showing who they are and the true nature of that regime. Oh, and by the way, all of these guys are billionaires, right? They're communist dictators, and yet they're all billionaires. So how did that happen, right? How did they make these fortunes ruling a communist party where nominally they're paid an extremely modest amount, right? So it's time to start calling them out in that way, and with some pressure, this house of cards is going to fall.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate you guys talking about all this stuff. One of the things that we do have to deal with is we do have all of this incursion, right? But we don't have very much excursion. And so, what Pete, the counterintelligence agent, would say, oh my God, our inability to hold ourselves accountable with classified information at our senior levels. If I was adversarial towards the U.S., I would park a Pete in D.C. and start infiltrating. I would get hired as the chief of staff for a senator's office. I would do all of these things, right? I would honeypot with House of Representative members, and I would create tremendous influence. And that's the influence that we know about, And if Pete has done his job, it's all going to be
Eric Swalwell, right, Pete? I mean,
these are, you're clever,
they have done this, actually.
Yeah.
So.
And it's not a party thing. It's pervasive, right? So if there's 2, there's 20. Easy. And it's not just Democrats. It's going to be all of them. And by the way, our Congress people don't go broke either. And so they have a lot to lose. So they won't hold themselves accountable. But you don't hear about us going over to China to do the same thing within their political system, because they won't have it, right? They're much more closed off than we are.
Actually, today there was just a report out of Reuters today that talked about a CIA program that was started in the Trump administration that just got exposed today. You may not have seen it.
Oh, nice. No, I haven't seen that yet. Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it's a new report. It's a leaked report. I wish it wasn't leaked. We shouldn't be leaking stuff like that, which is a whole nother issue that you referenced.
I think you can leak it. I think you can leak it, and you can make a whole bunch of extra ones that are happening that aren't happening, and just say, yeah, we're all over your ass.
Right. Well, the point was that we were trying to do something like that. Maybe it wasn't with the details we don't know, but there was some effort made. So there's been some efforts, but usually you don't talk about them in the public domain. I mean, if you want to keep people alive, because we also have other stories about people that actually got rolled up and were assassinated. So that's another thing that we have to be concerned with. I guess, Pete, when I hear your questions, I say to myself, well, so then what? Do we just bend over and say, kiss it all goodbye? I mean, there's got to be something that you can do.
Yeah. No, that there does. And I love that we had this conversation, and I'm going to have to stop this thing in about 2 minutes because I've got another thing I've got to do. But, and there's room to have more conversations. I'd love to have you guys come back on and talk to some other experts so that we can have this conversation, because I don't think anybody who's got foreign policy chops is looking at saying our relationship with China is perfect. We are ensnared. We are going in the bad direction. How do we get better at that? So just briefly, I'll give each of you guys a chance to kind of wrap this up. So if you take like a minute or two each, and then we'll call that a show. So I guess, Jim, you go first and just kind of give me your last 90 seconds on China and everything else.
Well, first of all, thanks for having us on. And, the thesis of the book is to say, hey, we need to be prepared. We weren't prepared. So we need to take action now. And Americans, regardless of your party, regardless of your feelings about whoever was in power, need to get serious about the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And you have to take action. I saw a question there. What can I do locally? You need to get active locally with your local governments and engage all the way up. But you can't just sit back and watch TV and say, well, it's not my job.
Yeah. Great. Brad?
Pete, well, thanks very much for having us and in allowing us to talk about the book and engaging in the conversation with your insightful questions. I think they were very helpful in moving and illuminating some of these issues. I would just say, upon reflection, things have to change, right? They can't go on as they have been. China is an existential threat to the United States that has to be addressed. And the policies that we pursued for the last generation are not the right ones. If we continue the engagement in school, we're going to lead to ruin. So what we need to do is educate ourselves, of course, at every level about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and its hyper-aggressive nature and policies, and then take actions at the local level, of course, through the individuals you support, at a political level, but also at the civic level as well. Get involved in Tibetan societies, right? Get involved in human rights societies, folks that are interested in human rights in China, religious freedom in China. There's so much to do to help the Chinese people free themselves from the control, the yoke of this tyranny. At the end of the day, all Americans value freedom. We disagree on so many other aspects about it, but we all support, of course, the importance of freedom and of liberty and of human rights. And all Americans, therefore, have a stake in this fight. All Americans, the demos, as you described earlier, have a stake in this because the future of human rights is either going to be bright, essentially, if the United States is successful in the struggle, or it's going to be essentially a descent into the abyss of tyranny if the CCP wins it. So thank you very much, Pete.
Yeah, thanks, fellas. And really, I do want to have you guys come back on, talk more about this and talk more broadly with some other people too, because it's a conversation that you can't just have once for 54 minutes and be done with it. I'm going to roll the credits, and I will check in with you guys before we go. But everybody else, thank you all so much. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.